Hello, welcome back to Kim Reads. As we continue with the Haunted Carousel. Chapter 17, Double Stakeout. Nancy rushed to undo the woman's gag. "Mrs. Harrod!" she exclaimed. "Are you all right?" The woman's eyes flickered open, but they scarcely seemed to focus, and the only audible response was a few faint mumbled words. I don't know. Where am I?" Before Nancy could reply, Rose Harrod's eyes rolled up and her eyelids drooped shut again. She was awfully dazed and disoriented. "She still must be under the effects of that drugs the fellows gave her," Ned declared grimly. But Nancy shook her head. "I doubt if whatever he slipped into her coffee would keep her under this long. Most likely they sedated her again after they brought her here to the cottage." The cottage, though barely furnished, at least had electricity and running water. Ned switched on the overhead light since dusk was gathering fast outside, and untied the ropes binding Mrs. Harrod. Meanwhile, Nancy wrung out her handkerchief in cold water. Together, they raised Rose Harrod to a sitting position and managed to revive her, but she was only able to stammer only a confused words about the kidnapping before slumping unconscious again. "We gotta get her to a doctor right away," Ned decided. "Yes, the sooner the better," Nancy agreed. "I'll help you carry her out to the car." "No problem, I can carry her." Ned, a well-muscled 6-footer, easily gathered the woman in his arms, and minutes later they were speeding back to town. After they had delivered Mrs. Harrod to the emergency room of the River Heights Hospital, Nancy called headquarters to report what happened. By the time she hung up, the intern on duty had finished examining the patient. "She's been drugged all right," he told Nancy and Ed, "but I don't think there'll be any permanent ill effects. In any case, I want to keep her here under observation, at least overnight." The two young people went to a nearby restaurant to settle down at last to their delayed dinner, but both were still too keyed up over the events of the evening to eat much. Moreover, Nancy was already laying plans for her night's detective work. "Will you help me, Ned?" she asked. When he eagerly agreed, Nancy explained what she had in mind. Then she made several calls from a payphone in the restroom. She succeeded in contacting reporter Rick Jason, George's friend Neil Sawyer, the electrical engineering student, and the park policeman, Officer Doyle, who had gone off duty. All three promised to meet her shortly before 11 p.m., the same wooden stakeout spot where she and Ned had kept watch on the carousel on Monday night. It was long past 9:30 when Nancy and Ned finally left the restaurant. They drove first to police headquarters when Nancy borrowed a pair of police walkie-talkie radios. Then they drove to the Trent's house. Nancy had already called on Joy from the restaurant and learned that she had a key to the daycare center, since Joy did volunteer work there in addition to lending her carousel horse for the children's enjoyment. Ned waited in the car while Nancy went up to ring the bell. Joy herself answered the door and handed Nancy the key. "Something tells me you have an exciting evening ahead," she said enviously. The young sleuth chuckled and held up crossed fingers. "I just hope it doesn't get too excited for my hell." After leaving Joy's house, Nancy and Ned headed for the daycare center. They parked well out of sight of their destination and walked the rest of the way. At this late hour, the whole surrounding neighborhood lay dark and silent. The only sounds were an occasional faint echo of the traffic from Riverside Avenue, which bordered the park several blocks away. Nancy and Ned found a shadowy spot among the tall pines and hemlocks and bushes from which they could keep watch unseen in the big old house. During dinner, they found time to glance at the photo store in the center's carousel horse, which had appeared in the evening paper. "You think that'll be enough to attract the same burglars who broke into Joy Trent's house?" Ned inquired softly. "That or the television news bit, I hope," Nancy replied, "assuming my hunch is right, of course." As the hands of her wristwatch kept around 11 o'clock, Nancy finally left Ned to keep watch alone while she went to check with her three cohorts outside the amusement park. Rick, Jason, Neil Sawyer, and Officer Doyle were all waiting at the agreed-upon spot just outside the park's pipe and chain barrier as Nancy came walking along the dark footpath to join them. Rick Jason was in high spirits at the prospect of a possible new scoop. So this is how the famous girl detective gets her man, huh? He bantered. Nancy's blue eyes twinkled in the moonlight. That remains to be seen. Minutes later, the midway lights were turned off, and the amusement park area gradually settled down to stillness and darkness. At last, Neil Sawyer backed over the pipe chain barrier and made his way cautiously toward the carousel. When he returned, he was grinning broadly. "Did my ploy work?" Nancy inquired. "You bet. There's a radio relay switch at the control box, just like I described to you," he reported with a triumphant look. "Marvelous," Nancy grinned back. "George certainly recommended the right technical expert." After a hasty final discussion with Neil, Rick, and Officer Doyle, Nancy left the park and returned to Ned at their spy post outside the daycare center. "Any developments, Ned?" "Nothing so far. I just wish we bought something comfortable to sit on." Nancy giggled softly. "Never mind. At least there's enough grass and parking. There's enough grass and undergrowth to keep the pine needles from pricking us." She leaned against her friend's shoulder, and Ned slipped his arm around her waist. 20 minutes went by pleasantly as they chatted under their teeth and enjoyed each other's company. Suddenly there was a crackle of radio static. An officer of Doyle's voice came over Nancy's walkie-talkie. "The trap has been sprung." And that's the end of that chapter. See you later.